Hi, everyone. I wanted to welcome you. My name is Evelyn Lim. I'm the Director of Policy at the American Cornerstone Institute. Thank you all for joining Dr. Carson and I for this Cornerstone conversation, where we highlight the important issues that are affecting all of us today. It is March 2021, a year since the WHO declared a global pandemic. And today we are talking about school reopenings and the importance of in-person learning after we've had nearly a year of school closures in many jurisdictions. I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Lindsey Burke. She is the Director for the Center for Education Policy at the Heritage Foundation and the Mark A. Kolokotronis Fellow in Education. Dr. Burke holds her bachelor's degree in politics from the Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia, and a Master of Teaching degree in foreign language education from the University of Virginia. She earned her PhD in education policy from George Mason University, where she examined the intersection of education choice and institutional theory. And of course, Dr. Ben Carson, former HUD secretary, world-renowned neurosurgeon, and the founder and chair of the American Cornerstone Institute. So Dr. Carson, I wanted to thank you for joining us, obviously. I wanted to ask, why is this such an important topic that we need to address today?
Well, thank you, Evelyn, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Burke to talk about this incredibly important subject. You know, it has personal meaning for me because, education and school made such a huge difference in my life. And, I was a horrible student. I had a terrible temper. There were all kinds of things that were going to lead me down the wrong pathway. And a lot of that was changed by my mother, who made me start reading books. But also, there were some amazing teachers who took a personal interest in me. And, when you don't have those relationships with some of those incredible educators, you miss out. There's no question about it. I remember at my high school band teacher, I had won a scholarship to Interlochen. Anybody who knows much about music know that's pretty rare. And I would have been the first student from my high school ever to get that, and been a big feather in a band teacher's hat. And he said, Benny, don't accept it. He says, because you're going to be a great doctor one day, and I don't want this to interfere. And he was thinking a lot more about me than he was himself. And, I think about Miss Schoenberger, who later became Mrs. Miller. She was an English teacher, but she kept me on the straight and narrow because when I started getting involved with the gangs and stuff, she made it quite clear that if I didn't get out of them, she would kill me. So, those kinds of things are very, very helpful in getting you back on the right track. But also, when you think about just living in our society, you had you have to know, how to read a contract. You have to know when somebody says 5% reduction, you have to know how to calculate 5%. You have to be able to make decisions about whether you should buy a car or lease a car. Unless you have these rudimentary skills, life becomes so much more difficult for you. And just think about poverty. It was the Brookings Institute that did the big study on poverty. They said there were 3 things a person could do that would reduce their likelihood of living in poverty to 2% or less. Number 1, finish high school. Number 2, get married. Number 3, wait until you're married to have children. But think about how incredibly important that is in terms of your lifestyle and your quality of life. There's really no one single factor that has that big an impact.
That's so true. And I think there's a lot of discussion about how remote learning works for some students, but not for others. And I think, child development experts have been saying that the long-term consequences of remote learning will take years for them to really understand. I wanted to talk a little bit about, is this really presenting another opportunity gap for those low income and minority students, the special needs children who need perhaps a little bit more guidance in school as you mentioned?
Well, there's no question about it. We're in the process of losing a generation because, everything in education builds upon the thing that was before it. And if you have gaps in that, then your educational foundation is lacking. It's sort of like the alphabet. We can read because we know all 26 letters. But what if we knew 21? That's still pretty good, but we missed those other 5. You know how difficult it's going to be to read all of a sudden? And then you start thinking, well, I'm not very smart. And the whole trajectory of your life begins to change. Well, we're doing that to a whole generation of people now. It will have an impact on the rest of their lives. And I think this is something that maybe some of the teachers unions and people like that are really not thinking about, what the impact of this will be on the lives of our most precious resource, which is our young people. And we can't get it back. And that's one reason that we need to be talking right now about immediately getting rid of this silliness and getting back on track. The science tells us that it's safe and,
So I did want to, we'll get to the science later, but I did want to talk a little bit about this lost generation, because Dr. Burke, I was just reading the other day about this epidemic of absenteeism that many people don't even think about.
Yeah, it's a real problem. And let me just say first, thank you to the American Cornerstone Institute. I'm delighted to be part of your inaugural Cornerstone conversation. So thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Carson, for sitting down and discussing such an important topic to so many families across the country. Evelyn, you're right. I mean, this is a real crisis. Many students have been out of school for a year now that we're into this pandemic with so many schools closed. And just imagine how consequential that would be for anyone at age 13, 14, 15. It's not just the academics, it's missed school sports, it's scholarship implications, counseling, access to friends. And I think it's often those contemporaneous conversations with teachers. And it's things like homecomings and proms that children are missing out on. An estimated 3 million children have not showed up for in-person instruction or online classes since March. These students are basically just missing from the education system now. And so we know this is having real academic impacts as well. And it can be tricky to pin this down, and we're still somewhat early into what the data say about these impacts, but McKinsey estimates that the shift to remote school in the spring set students back, white students back anywhere from 1 to 3 months, and minority students lost 3 to 5 months based on their estimates. We know that the number of failing grades, the number of Fs given out by school districts across the country is also way up. But every student last March became an accidental homeschooler. And so many millions of students across the country are still in that position right now. And, I would say while remote learning works for some kids when it is a choice that they have made because it's the right fit for them, that is very different from what we're seeing right now with what I would say is more akin to crisis online learning provided by the public school districts. And in some cases, just to illustrate that point, throughout the year last year, some of these large public school districts weren't even taking attendance or recording grades as part of that crisis remote learning. So that's why I say it looks very different than well-constructed online learning options that families have selected into pre-pandemic. But, I think right now the problems facing students and families as a result of this pandemic could have been solved or at least vastly mitigated if we funded students rather than systems. Because in school districts that are still remaining closed, a big reason is that parents cannot just walk with their feet with their child's per pupil education spending. And so I would argue that in districts that do remain closed right now, that at the very least, parents deserve a refund, but all families should be able to select into schools that are the right fit for their children, that reflect their values and hopes and aspirations for their children. And I would say, just to comment, Dr. Carson, on your point about the success sequence that you brought up a few minutes ago. That's exactly right. We know that there is an instructional formula out there that so many families want their children to hear. At Heritage, we recently conducted a nationally representative survey of families across the country of school-age children, and we put this question to them in the survey: do you think that your children in public schools should be taught about outcomes related to the success sequence? Graduate high school, get a job or attend college, get married, and then have children. And it was overwhelming with our respondents. North of 80% of families agreed that yes, that is something schools should teach children, is that if you follow this sequence, your likelihood of ending up in poverty approaches zero almost. And so unfortunately, that's not something that public schools are teaching today, but something that they could absolutely do. So just wanted to add that note. Completely concur with you, Dr. Carson, on the success sequence.
Well, that reminds me of a time I visited south side of Chicago, and I went to Wendell Phillips High School. And you would have thought a rock star came in, because one of the banks had bought my book, Gifted Hands, for all the students. And so they were all kind of familiar. But, I said, let's go through the sequence of the really coolest guy out there and the nerd. And I went through their life. And at the end, I said, how many people want to be cool? No one raised their hand. How many want to be nerd? They all raised their hand, because they had really never thought about, what happens to people. And, the other thing is that there's so many people who, proclaim themselves as the savior of the poor and the disenfranchised. And yet they're not pushing to get the kids back in school, because who is hurt the most? It's those who don't have the latest computers, who don't have high-speed internet, and who don't have the kind of support systems. They're getting even further behind. And so this is really impacting them extremely negatively. And I wish those people would somehow begin to look at the big picture here.
I think you're absolutely right in terms of all of these other secondary effects of school closures. We haven't even talked about the unmet needs that these children that normally ones who would get their perhaps only meal of the day at school. But there's other effects, including, you both mentioned social effects, emotional effects. And we're seeing a huge increase in emotional mental disorders and substance use. Can you talk a little bit about that, Dr. Burke?
Right. So the impacts aren't just academic, to your point. We know that pediatricians are reporting weight gain among children that puts them at greater risk for diseases like diabetes in the future. They are exercising less. They're likely eating more while at home. Maybe we are all guilty of that to some extent, but all while being in front of a screen for hours upon hours each day. And then I would say there are the much more concerning issues. The CDC reports increases in the percentage of children who are admitted to the emergency room for mental health reasons. And sadly, suicides are up. If you look at districts like Clark County, Nevada, the number of suicides in Clark County among students doubled over 2019 figures. And that sad reality has pushed the district, which is the 5th largest school district in the country, to try to reopen as soon as possible. And we're seeing this in other areas too. In Arizona, the superintendent there recently discussed the rise in student suicides in districts across her state. So, it's not only that isolation from friends and teachers could be contributing, but Evelyn, to your point, many children are accessing mental health services in schools, which for a lot of these children aren't currently available.
I think that brings up a good point about a narrative that I've been hearing a lot, which is that, that kids are resilient. and that they can bounce back easily. But I'm wondering if we're pressing the boundaries of that a little too far, perhaps unnecessarily. Dr. Carson, obviously you were on the White House task force. You have been intimately involved in understanding what this pandemic means. Can you talk a little bit about why, given where we are with the virus, we wouldn't be able to open up, or we should be opening up schools?
Well, first of all, we need to recognize that our society has evolved to include school. It's part of our social fabric, and it impacts the workplace because one of the things that has happened in the last couple of decades is a massive return to the workforce of women, of mothers. Now, if school's not open,
I think we may have lost you for a second.
you know, my mother had to work 3 jobs at a time. She would leave at 5 in the morning and get back at midnight. So talk about the ultimate latchkey kids. We were
Dr.
them.
Carson, sorry to interrupt, but we lost you for a little bit. Would you mind?
No, I was saying, you know, in terms of the impact that parents have and the need, and particularly mothers, and especially single moms, built into their social fabric and network is school. And if you don't have school, it puts a gigantic hole in the equation. And I was just reminding people in my own history, you know, my mother was a single working mom. She worked 3 jobs at a time, leaving at 5 in the morning, getting back after midnight. So we frequently didn't even see her in the course of a day. But we were extremely fortunate. Somebody upstairs was looking out for us because we did a lot of dangerous stuff. My mother would have died if she had any idea what we were doing. But you know, that's the reason that you need to have parents there, or you know, teachers, or somebody who's looking after kids. That because they are kids. But it also has a tremendous impact on our economy, because obviously you need people working, but also if you don't have to, if you've got 6 or 8 hours of the day in which you don't have to take care of the kids, that means you can devote that time to some entrepreneurial endeavors. And that's how businesses get started. And it's small businesses that are the backbone of the economy of this nation. So, you know, this is all tied together. If one part of it fails, it has a domino effect on all the other parts of our economy and our society. And I think that's something that, again, many of the teacher unions and others have really not taken into consideration. They don't really understand sometimes how important they are to the well-functioning of our society.
You brought up the unions, and I would like to talk about them a little bit in terms of what role they've been playing in an evolving role in school reopenings. Dr. Burke, have you looked at this issue in terms of what the science has said and then what the unions are countering with?
That was a very diplomatic way for you to put it, the evolving nature of how the teachers' unions are interacting when it comes to school reopening. Look, I would say that they are not following the science. That has been the most clear thing over the past year when it comes to the teachers' unions, is that they really have tried to use this crisis to, unfortunately, advance a lot of their long-held political ends. But on the science, we have a lot of it now, right? Last month, CDC researchers reported in the Journal of the American Medical Association that, quote, the preponderance of available evidence from the fall school semester has been reassuring and that there has been little evidence that schools have contributed meaningfully to increased community transmission. That's from JAMA. That's fantastic news. We know that that builds on a UNICEF report from a few months ago that found they looked at data from 191 countries and found no consistent association between school reopening status and COVID-19 infection rates. So the science overwhelmingly supports schools reopening. And yeah, we're really just not seeing the teachers' unions follow the science. As I said, they have done everything that they can to keep schools closed in order to fulfill what I would say are some long-held political demands that they want to see fulfilled. Medicare for all, a wealth tax, a ban on charter schools, defunding the police. These were demands that the Los Angeles Teachers Union called for before they would agree to bless school reopening. And these demands have repeated themselves in cities across the country that have a strong teachers union presence: Philadelphia, Chicago. I'm sitting here in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, and we have seen the teachers unions really just shift the goalposts considerably over the past few months. First, they said in late December, we'll bless school reopening once we know it's safe to do so. And all of the evidence suggests that it is. And then they said, well, we'll bless going back to school once teachers get the vaccine. And so teachers in Virginia got priority on the vaccination schedule. But then that still wasn't good enough for the unions here. They shifted the goalposts again. And some are now saying, well, we need to wait until children are vaccinated against COVID. There's not even an approved COVID-19 vaccine for children under the age of 16. And so that's basically a call to keep schools closed indefinitely. And that, of course, is going to be unacceptable for families across the country, as it should be. As I mentioned earlier, basically 3 million children have effectively had no formal education over the past year. And we, I would add, are really unique in this approach. If you look around the world, London, Belgium, France, Israel, Spain, Russia, everywhere, schools are open, teachers are teaching, students are learning in person next to their friends. And so I really think the problem here has more to do with special interest groups like the teachers union than it does following the science.
Those are very good points. And interestingly, the science tells us that the mortality rate for the 0 to 19 age group is 0.0097%. I mean, that's about as close to zero as you can get. And we also have all these laboratories. We have Catholic schools and a lot of other schools that have been open throughout this whole time, and we have not seen any increased transmission. So at some point, it actually is beneficial to use your brain and to actually look at the data and make decisions based on actual evidence as opposed to on emotion or agendas. And basically, that's what's being done. They have an agenda. I think you very well articulated what that agenda is. And it unfortunately does not include educating our children.
Sure, it has occurred to me just throughout this whole experience that they keep moving the goalposts, and until they get what they want, and it just the impact on our kids has all of these downstream impacts that we've talked about. I wanted to talk a little bit about what you mentioned about we need to trust what we're seeing on the ground in terms of school reopenings. I have a 7-year-old, as you know. He does go to a Catholic school. They've been open since August without any issues. How can a parent whose child maybe isn't in school, how can they kind of help this issue along?
Well, they can go to any meetings that are involving the school board, and they can try to get them to actually look at the data, to do a benefit risk analysis. Just get a whiteboard and list the benefits are of in-person education, and then list the risk of keeping kids out of school. developing those social interactions that give them the ability to function as adults in our society. There's so many things other than math and reading that you learn in school, particularly in dealing with your peers. And that social interaction has a lot to do with whether you're going to be successful or not. There are people who have IQ of 150 or more, but they have no concept of how to interact with other people. And it severely limits their usefulness in society. And in many cases, it turns out to lead them to psychopathic activity. So, we obviously have a real duty here in terms of what you can do as a specific parent. You can wring your hands and act helpless, or you can get out there and become a real advocate for the children. And unfortunately, it seems like the people with the loudest voices are frequently advocating on the other side. We need to know that there are people on the side of logic and common sense also, and they need to open their mouths as well.
And I would just add to that, or I guess just concur with the school board point, because I think that that's something that we too often overlook is this engagement with the school board that's so important. School boards are responsive, should be responsive to parents and to community members in the communities that they represent. But they do need to hear from parents and taxpayers in order to know how to really be responsive and meet their needs. And there are 14,000 plus school boards across the country in school districts, 100,000 school board members. So there are many, many, many opportunities to engage, but I would just wholeheartedly concur with that. That is one of the best ways for parents to really hear their voices, have their voices heard, is to show up and go talk to those school board meetings and really talk about priorities that they have for their children in their schools.
Absolutely.
Well, I just wanted to bring up one other point because of this timeliness, but as you all know, President Biden signed the COVID relief bill last week, which included some funding for $170 billion for schools and colleges. So having not read the full bill, I'm wondering if you have any reflections on it. Dr. Burke, we can start with you.
Sure. You're being diplomatic again, Evelyn. Some funding. It is a lot of funding in both this proposal and then the prior two spending bills that passed. So the CARES Act back in March a year ago, there was a second relief package that passed at the end of December. And then this relief package, spending package that was just signed into law by President Biden last week. This, as you correctly note, this most recent third spending package has $170 billion in it for K-12 schools and for higher education. If you parse that out a little bit, it's about $130 billion for K-12 schools. If you add up all of the additional money, and remember, this is additional spending on top of the normal annual appropriations that the education sector receives. If you add up all of this spending from March, from December, and then this newest package, it's an additional $282 billion. That is, just to put it in perspective, 4 times the annual discretionary budget of the entire Department of Education. So we're really talking about just breathtaking sums of money that, I think we can anticipate we'll hear calls in the future to keep those elevated spending levels high. But, I would note too that Catholic schools were brought up a second ago. 90% of Catholic schools are open and operating and functioning for in-person instruction. And that has been the case for months now. And they have done it without these significant infusions of cash. They operate at far less per pupil spending than traditional district schools do. They're able to do it with flying colors. We know that districts overall can reopen safely. Maybe they just need to pop over to a couple of Catholic schools and have the teachers union head make a visit and get a few tips there for reopening.
Absolutely. And, I resonate very strongly with that. But also, what is education all about? It's about creating a situation where the children can have a better future. Now, how is their future going to be any better if we continue to add to the national debt, which they are going to be responsible for paying back? The debt service will soon be the biggest annual obligation of the federal government. And where are they going to pay for it? Through taxes. And by creating this amount of debt, it's going to necessitate extraordinary taxes. And if the taxes are that high, it's going to be very difficult for people to achieve the American dream that we have been so used to. And, this is one of those big picture items that I think we really need to be talking about, because, it was Thomas Jefferson who said it is immoral to steal money from future generations. He would be terrified if he could see what was going on and what we are doing to those who follow us. It means that we really don't care about them. But I really think we do. I think maybe we're just not thinking about it.
That is a great note to kind of end our conversation and give a lot of people something to think about. I wanted to thank Dr. Lindsey Burke for joining us today. I know you came out recently with a new paper and wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about it here.
Well, great. Thank you very much for that. We do have an interesting new paper out on housing redlining from the 1930s, government redlining in the housing sector, and what we see as really lingering effects on education opportunity. And so we walk through that unfortunate history and what those effects are today, and talk about ways that we could advance some specific remedies there, namely that school districts should stop drawing attendance zone boundaries, which too often look like these red line boundaries from the 1930s. But districts should stop drawing those boundaries within their district and allow students to attend any public school within the district. So basically complete open enrollment. And then of course, marry that policy with more robust private school choice options like education savings accounts that I think personally every child should have access to from day one, the minute that they enter kindergarten, to really allow them to select into learning environments that are the right fit for them. And, I would say if we had these policies in place right now, so many of the negative effects on education as a result of COVID-19 would have been either bypassed entirely or mitigated significantly.
Sounds like a great follow-up topic for us. And if people are interested, they can go to heritage.org and find your paper there. So, and Dr. Carson, I wanted to give you the last word.
Well, I just appreciate this forum. I want to thank Dr. Burke for not only today, but your continued work in this area. And I ask people just to exercise a little bit of common sense here. And, we, the American people, are not each other's enemies. And we should stop allowing people to manipulate us and make us think that everything is some kind of religious or political issue. It's not. A lot of it is just common sense. We want to prepare our young people for the next generation of things that they will be involved in. And we can't continue to operate out of fear. Fear leads you to do things that are not particularly rational. And that's why during World War II, FDR said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, because it makes you do stupid stuff like keep the kids out of school at a time when they need to be learning.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us for a Cornerstone conversation. We'll see you next time.